This week's National Interest debates some of the issues raised by the film Kashmir Files. Although I haven't seen Vivek Agnihotri's film as yet, and as we go along, stay with me. I will explain to you why I haven't seen it, and you might actually agree with my reasons, or at least sympathize with my reasons. Now, a sense of Kashmir Files, at least in one sense, is correct. That is that Kashmiri Pandits were given much worse than what you would call a raw deal. They were driven out, they were bullied out of their homes 32 years ago. And we'll talk about this in detail. But the sum and substance of our argument is a catharsis is needed for every tragedy, but catharsis needs justice. Without justice and without truth-telling, there can be no catharsis. Without truth, there can be no reconciliation. Remember, Nelson Mandela started that process of truth and reconciliation in South Africa, which is now held out as a great example of repair work for historic wrongs and for forgiveness, for mass forgiveness. Again, that reconciliation would not have been possible until there was truth-telling. So reconciliation needs truth-telling and for us to debate the truth. And that is the one sense in which this film has served a purpose. Now, for all cases of mass justice, this logic applies. It is ridiculous that Kashmir Files debate is now trapped in questions like how many Pandits were killed, right? We are still reducing one of our greatest tragedies to an argument over a scorecard of killings. And I will repeat that point as we go along and explain it. Now, what Vivek Agnihotri's latest film, The Kashmir Files, wants to convey is correct in a sense, in one sense. There is zero doubt or question that between around November 1989 to May 1990, almost all of the native Hindus from Kashmir Valley, predominantly Kashmiri Pandits, had been brutally forced out by Islamized forces in an Indian equivalent of ethnic cleansing. In fact, ethnic cleansing is an expression that gained global currency much later with the Bosnian crisis, with the crisis in the Balkans. Many were killed, beginning with the old social activist and advocate Tika Lal Taplu in September 1989. So this started before the VP Singh government took over. Unattributed advertisements appeared in local Urdu newspapers asking Hindus to leave. It's all a reality that should be well known to two generations of Hindus. And probably if you think that this has not been recorded adequately enough, you might have a point. And I might in fact plan a separate episode of Cut the Clutter talking about that aspect. That needs a little more research, and I will do that maybe over this weekend and come back to you. Now, historians, storytellers, and filmmakers, most of all, will each find their own versions of the truth. In a polarized and traumatized environment, they will also focus on what affects them the most. As Clint Eastwood showed us, Iwo Jima had two versions of the truth: Flags of Our Fathers from the American side and Letters from Iwo Jima from the Japanese side. But nobody, you can have two versions, but nobody can question the ferocity of the battle there and the heroism of professional soldiers. Similarly, whatever your view on how 89-90 happened, the fact is nobody can deny that brutal expulsion, violent expulsion of Kashmiri Hindus, especially the Kashmiri Pandits, from their home in a state of India. It is ridiculous and tragic, therefore, that the Kashmir Files debate has become trapped in questions like how many Kashmiri Pandits were actually killed. Was the number in two figures, 3, 4, 5, 6? Some even take it up to 7 millions died, right? Was it an ethnic cleansing, forced exodus, genocide, or another Holocaust? That is a live debate right now. The argument will yield nothing. This argument will yield nothing. What matters 32 years after that great national tragedy is that we are still reducing it to an argument over the scorecard of killings. The numbers, any which way, will neither lighten nor deepen the tragedy. And the national shame involved in a large community, a minority in its home state being bullied out of it, in a democratic republic with armed forces, police, and intelligence agencies that rank among the most formidable in the world. That's a shame. that one side feels free to add zeros to the toll in a manner so cavalier. What's a few zeros between friends when we are talking of fellow human beings? And the other would shed tears over the atrocities, awful atrocities, on the Rohingya in Myanmar on the one hand, but then ask that Kashmiri Pandit should be treated with a light touch. They are two sides of the same coin of irony. Nothing I am saying here endorses or denounces the film. I had mentioned earlier I haven't seen it. Yes, I haven't seen it yet for the same reason that I haven't seen Ranveer Singh's 83 or Alia Bhatt starrer Gangubai Kathiawadi. I'm still too COVID scarred to step into a cinema hall with other people where I know that mask discipline is very poorly followed. Now, whatever the quality of filmmaking or research, that's a different point. I'm not a film reviewer. The Kashmir Files has made a positive contribution by exposing a lacerating but hidden 32-year-old wound. The downside is the scary and shameful, bigoted response by audiences in cinema halls, the demonizing of an entire community and calls for reprisals on innocent Muslim families. Brilliant journalist and author Rahul Pandita, who wrote the landmark account of the 1989-90 atrocity, he is a Kashmiri Pandit himself, in his landmark book, Our Moon Has Blood Clots. Even he says, despite being attacked, even he says that it's a kind of catharsis for Kashmiri Pandits after 32 years. Finally, they see it finally as an acknowledgement of their plight, and they must have it. Let them have their catharsis. That's an important point, and it is worth exploring further, which is what I'm doing in this national interest. Now, in 75 years since independence, India has ensured many sizable tragedies. Nor is India unique in having lived through violent evolution. But one common and unfortunate trait across the subcontinent is our inability to look the truth in the eye, accept, if not confess, what we've done wrong, find closure for both the victim and the perpetrators, and hope to move on after punishing the guilty. But for that, first of all, we have to find the truth. Our culture and civilization takes a circular view of things. Everything that's happening now must have a root cause somewhere else. So fix that first, which will have a root cause somewhere else. So fix that first. So we spend all our time fixing the distant past, and the present then moves on into the future, and the past continues on, dovetails nicely into the future. Nicely or cruelly, that is a call that you make. So our arguments go on and on and on and on. Ifs, buts, root causes, whataboutery, and worse. This goes on. The shameful fact is, as a nation and a system of laws, we have failed to bring to account perpetrators of our biggest mass crimes in our independent history. And I'll just recount some from my years as a reporter. Besides the many communal riots that spread across decades in our independent history, unko chhod dete hain. Let's leave them aside for a moment. Let's look at what happened from 80s onwards. So there was a 6-hour mass cull of Muslims in Delhi. Nearly 3,500 were killed in 6 hours. I covered that story. I broke that story. Unfortunately, I was covering the Northeast for Indian Express at that point, and that story I had broken. The massacres of 6 in 1984, another story I covered. Kashmiri Pandits in 1989-90 is also one of these great tragedies. Unfortunately for me, I didn't get to cover it. Massacres of Hindus in Punjab between 1983 and 1993, these were quite sizable, although we tend to forget these now. This went on for a decade. And massacres of Muslims in Gujarat, 2002. In none of these, our system has found justice for the victims or handed over justice to the perpetrators. Now, what is settled by law or by courts doesn't necessarily bring closure to an issue, but it helps. It doesn't hurt, it helps. In our system, on the other hand, every self-inflicted calamity becomes an eternal partisan argument. In some cases, it pretends to fade away, as with Nelly. But the reason I use the word pretense is that you can push mass injustice under the carpet. It can be temporarily forgotten. but it's never forgiven. It goes into oral history from generation to generation and becomes a never-ending blood feud. That is our pain as a society. We must find closure. For closure, you need the truth, and after truth, you need the justice. And because we don't do it, such grievances never go away. So be prepared for a Kashmir Files-like film on partition bloodshed in the Bengal one of these days. And the consequences it will unleash inevitably. Societies and communities don't forget their saddest moments, but they can forgive. No truth is too inconvenient to be put aside. See, France and Germany are friends now, right? No truth is too inconvenient to be put aside. Once you accept the plight of the Kashmiri Pandits, apologize collectively for the fact that our nation failed to give them due protection under law and constitution, you can take the argument further that the same mass criminality by terrorists, Pakistan-backed terrorists, invited the wrath of the entire might of the Indian army and security agencies. That since then nearly 20,000 mostly Kashmiri Muslims have been killed by the armed forces and also by Pakistan-controlled Muslim terrorists. They have no compunction killing their own. In fact, they might have killed more of their own fellow Kashmiri Muslims than Indian soldiers or the Hindus. That they will be taking the argument forward that there will be no durable peace in the valley until the Pandits can feel safe there. I'm not saying they go back and relocate and start living there again. That's a matter of choice. But they should feel safe there. Then they can make their choices. They cannot be denied their choices. And if they go there, they must feel safe as all Kashmiris do, not as Jews do in those protected camps on the West Bank. India's handling of Kashmir has been knee-jerk, seeking cynical quick fixes, and it is personified best or the worst by a man called Yasin Malik. On 25th January 1990, he was alleged to have led a terror squad that assassinated 4 unarmed IAF officers and 2 women who were waiting in the same queue to board a bus. Everybody was unarmed. They were just simply waiting to board their bus to go to their destinations. This case came up for trial only 30 years later in 2020, and charges were framed. Why? Why did it take 30 years? It isn't as if Malik had absconded to Pakistan. He was here all the time in India, most of which was spent in comfort under lavish care of the quote-unquote agencies who thought they could now repackage him as a reformed terrorist turned man of peace. This when he never denied that he had killed those IAF officers. On a full interview on BBC's Hard Talk, he repeatedly asserted, I was then in armed struggle, they were Indian soldiers and a fair target. In fact, the BBC interviewer gave him many opportunities. He was asked repeatedly, do you deny that you killed them? And he only says, I was in the armed struggle, they were Indian soldiers, they were Indian armed forces, so they were fair target. In fact, even when he is asked if he feels responsible for the killing of those 2 women civilians, he says, I don't know. Ask the court why they haven't framed the charges. This interview, I suspect, must have been somewhere around 2000. So it's only now, 2020, that the charges were framed. For many spells, Yasin Malik had also been the darling of Indian peacemakers. Almost 25 years ago, while I was still a relatively new editor of the Indian Express, a widely respected activist, and I'm not mentioning her name right now because her position has changed radically since. So there is no point saying, but 25 years ago, she thought this way. She called me and said to me, look, join this delegation, peace delegation to Kashmir led by Kuldeep Nair. This is to save Yasin Malik's life, who is so invaluable for peace, she said, that agar ye bacha mar gaya, to bahut tragedy ho jayegi. It was easy for me to get out of it by simply stating the fact that the Indian Express Code of Ethics barred all its journalists for participating in any advocacy except on a few selected media freedom issues. A similar code of ethics also applies to journalists of ThePrint, and in fact, a similar code of ethics, some version of it applies to all respectable media publications across the world, across democracies. A similar code of ethics or some version of it also applies to all respectable media, free media outlets across the world. But I so wished I had spoken the truth instead. That I found the idea of sucking up to a mass killer of innocent civilians and unarmed IS officers revolting. And that if this was the way they were searching for peace, they were only going to make India angrier. How much angrier we unfortunately see in theaters playing the Kashmir Files now. For any catharsis, Yasin Maliks of any faith, whatever faith, of all our mass injustices must be brought to justice. They must be brought to account. The Germans converted old Nazi concentration camps into solemn memorials without airbrushing. So future generations would learn to never fall in the same trap. They will also feel ashamed and embarrassed about what their ancestors had done. I happened to visit Dachau, and it was a very, very brutal eye-opener and also a very solemn education. But that was only after the key Nazi mass killers were hunted down and punished. Those who might have survived might still be hunted down now. I think just a couple of years ago, somebody at the age of 98 or something was caught and handed out justice. Harsh, tough, well-deserved justice. To live in denial is to be locked in a vicious circle of injustice. As Nobel laureate and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel said, quote, "If we forget, the dead will be killed a second time," unquote. This applies to all mass injustice. It's a waste to argue over whether any of these was an exodus, ethnic cleansing, pogrom, genocide, or a Holocaust. Once again, in conclusion, every society, every now and then needs its own dose of truth and reconciliation, but there can be no reconciliation without the truth first.